These are places where shocking methods of torture are used. Places that have seen more suffering than a human being can bear. Places that come with an overwhelming realization: hell is real. For what in faith is a fiery realm of eternal torment, in reality are harrowing incidents and places that make our blood run cold. But what unimaginable things took place in secret? What is known about the unspeakable horror? And above all, how could it come to this? Hardly any other place is as reminiscent of a dystopian nightmare as Kowloon Walled City. Located on the eponymous Kowloon Peninsula, the former Hong Kong district was initially a Chinese military outpost. However, after the Second World War and the withdrawal of the Japanese occupation, the walled city promised a happy future for many Chinese refugees. Those who could not afford the expensive housing prices in Hong Kong were given affordable accommodation here. And yet the unchecked influx came at a high price. The walled city was uncontrollably paved over with high-rise buildings of up to 14 stories, transforming it into an unmanageable, virtually lawless slum. While the crammed-in families had an average of no more than 20 square meters at their disposal, the Hong Kong government dared not touch this closed-off world, because officially, it was still under Chinese rule. However, the Chinese authorities cared very little about the unimaginable conditions that prevailed in the walled city. In fact, the surreal place was more of a fleeting rumor than a reality. It was not on any city map, and most Hong Kongers did not even know it existed. As Hong Kong was already a modern, up-and-coming city at the time, the wildly cobbled-together buildings of the walled city simply wouldn't have fit in. Those who ventured into the narrow alleyways of the walled city later reported an unbearable stench. With 1.3 million inhabitants per square kilometer, this was the place with the highest population density in the world. The fact that the mass of people had no proper infrastructure to fall back on was all the more fatal. Waste from the slaughterhouses and cleaning chemicals simply ended up down the drain. Running water was only available if you paid a fee to the petty criminals. The sunlight barely had a chance to flood the narrow, high alleyways. Even during the day it was pitch dark here. While garbage piled up next to the washing lines, planes from the nearby airport flew over the surreal scene. After decades of being left to fend for themselves without outside support, both the British and Chinese governments finally realized that the conditions had become unbearable. In 1987, the decision was made to clear the entire site and demolish all the buildings. The slum was to make way for a green park. And although the residents were awarded compensation amounting to $350 million, some refused to leave their homes. But they had no say in the matter. Construction work was completed in April 1994. Today, only a museum reminds us that the peaceful park was once known as the forecourt to hell. Here, corpses blocked the way out. Calcutta, June 1756. In the early days of the 7 Years' War, the feud between the French and the English had escalated into bloody clashes. This was also the case in India. After the French guns had besieged Calcutta for 4 days, the 165 British soldiers and 200 civilians had no choice but to surrender. Soon afterwards, many of the defeated soldiers found themselves in the infamous Black Hole. This was a 4.3 by 5.5 meter dungeon in Fort William that turned into a mass grave on the night of June 20th, 1756. Survivor John Zephaniah Holwell later stated that a total of 146 people were crammed into the far too narrow cell. On average, each prisoner had only 46 square centimeters at their disposal. The first victims had already been crushed when they stood up and sat down. Many more died fighting for water, which was poured into the hole from outside with buckets. The unspeakable agony lasted from 7 in the evening until 6 in the morning. But when the Indian Nawab finally gave the order to open the dungeon, the task proved more difficult than expected. Because the door that opened it inwards was blocked by the piles of corpses that were piling up behind it. Consequently, it was up to the few survivors to remove the bodies of their fellow prisoners and make their way out. According to John Holwell's report, only 23 out of 146 people saw the light of day again. However, many historians express great doubts about the figures handed down. Some consider 64 prisoners and 43 victims to be more likely, while others put the number of deaths at 18. What is certain, however, is that the black hole incident became a symbol of the threat posed by the Nawab's army and further legitimized the violent takeover of Bengal. Only 3 out of 10 people left this place alive. Elmina Castle in present-day Ghana has 2 different titles. On the one hand, it is considered the oldest European building in West Africa, and on the other, it is a silent witness to the horrors of slavery. Christened Fort São Jorge da Mina by the Portuguese, the building was erected in 1482 to promote trade on the Gold Coast. This is where the Europeans traded gold, ivory, spices, and later, above all, people. For 150 years, the Portuguese plied their trade here. Later, the Dutch and British took over the terrifying business. It is estimated that between the 16th and 19th centuries, up to 12 million West Africans were enslaved and shipped to America, bought by the European settlers who ran sugarcane and tobacco plantations there. However, the 12 million slaves are only those who actually arrived in America. At least as many died during transportation to Elmina Castle, in its catacombs or on the ship. Sometimes it is even said that out of 10 slaves who arrived here, only 3 were shipped to America alive. Of course, these pitiful people did not go into slavery voluntarily, but in fact, it was not primarily the Europeans who went on the manhunt, but the cooperating African ethnic groups. Once captured, the slaves lost all rights to their own lives. The master was free to beat, abuse, rape, or kill his property. If it was discovered on the voyage to America that a slave had become pregnant as a result of the abuse, she was thrown overboard alive. If the pregnancy was discovered on African soil, the woman was still allowed to give birth to her child before being separated from her baby and taken to America. As soon as a slave fell out of favor, death row awaited him. Shackled and without light, the prisoners remained locked up here until they died of thirst. Why do so many people take their own lives here? Is it a curse? Is it the spirits of the dead dragging the living into the afterlife? Or can the sad incidents that occur in Aokigahara be explained by earthly means? What is certain is that the dense forest in the Japanese prefecture of Yamanashi casts a spell over many people who simply see no way out. Every year, a number of people take their own lives in Aokigahara, but it is uncertain exactly how many, because the Japanese authorities no longer publish figures on the number of deaths. When they still did, a total of 78 deaths were counted in 2002. The following year, the figure was 105. According to a widespread rumor, poor families were forced to abandon their children in the Aokigahara as early as the 19th century in order to escape the famine. However, while this story cannot be substantiated, the sad suicide rates in modern times are said to be based on 2 novels by the writer Matsumoto Seicho. Among other things, they tell of a young woman named Yuriko who, heartbroken, chooses suicide in Aokigahara. While the Japanese riot police have been regularly combing the forest for corpses since the early 1970s, they are confronted with a morbid problem. Aokigahara is recommended, both on the internet and in freely available literature, as an ideal place for suicide. In fact, suicide is still sometimes considered honorable in Japan. As a result, patrols, forest workers, and volunteers regularly roam the forest to track down suicidal people and offer them help. This is how brutally the CIA tortured its prisoners. What went by the inconspicuous code name Salt Pit was actually a secret CIA prison in Afghanistan that served a single purpose: to psychologically break the detainees and force them to cooperate. It has since leaked out that the U.S. Foreign Intelligence Service used some questionable techniques to achieve this. While the prisoners were kept in absolute isolation and complete darkness, loud music incessantly boomed in their ears. There was no adequate heating or sanitary facilities. The inmates had only a bucket at their disposal. Sometimes the prisoners were even stripped of their clothes. They were then placed in the central area, where they had to walk around for humiliation. Alternatively, the naked, shackled prisoners were hosed down with cold water and prevented from sleeping by any means necessary. Later, an interrogator reported finding a prisoner who had been chained standing up for 17 days. There were also stories of inmates who were hung upside down for days on end, who were not given any food, and who were subjected to mock executions. After the inhumane conditions became known, however, no one in charge claims to have known about the brutal practices. What is certain, however, is that 2 Afghan prisoners died there in 2005. An investigation by the Ministry of Defense concluded that they had been murdered. However, the only publicly known death in Salt Pit was that of Gul Rahman. The CIA officer in charge, Matthew Zerbel, ordered the guards to strip Gul from the waist down and chain him to the floor of his unheated cell. Soon afterwards, he was found dead. The autopsy revealed that he had frozen to death. Although this incident took place in November 2002, Rahman's relatives only learned of his fate in 2010. In the meantime, Zerbel had been promoted. No disciplinary proceedings were initiated against any CIA employee because of the death. Press subscribe now and never miss a new video again.